Kelvin, when you're supporting people with really complex behaviours of protest, particularly where there could be an interaction sometimes with the legal system as well, how do you personally think about the balance between protecting their human rights and also the focus on community safety?
That's a great question to start. I think that balance is probably one of the most challenging part of being a leader in the disability sector. Because first thing, when you talk about behaviors of protest, we need to remember that those behaviors are often a form of communication. Hence why I usually use the word behavior of protest. We've come a long way in terms of how we go behaviors of concern or challenging behaviors. I rather use the language of behavior of protest because someone is pretty much in a way trying to communicate something to you. And usually that formal communication can reflect, trauma, environmental stress, unmet needs, a lack of control in their life, in lives in some cases. But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge that there's a very real impact those behavior will have on other people, particularly staff that are supporting this person. So a real example of where this tension show up is when a staff member is impacted by an incident, whether it be psychological or physical. When this happens, it's very common for teams to strongly advocate for increased restrictive practice because their immediate concern is their safety. And that often can lead to some ethical challenges, and it becomes very real quick. So as a leader, you always try to understand and acknowledge the experiences of the staff member. You want to support them appropriately and ensure the team feels safe. And while also recognizing that any restrictive practice directly impact the human rights of the people who support. So the role becomes less about choosing a side, and it's more about supporting the team to navigate a very complex situation, which might involve some of the work we do with, the wider care team, which is where I first sort of connected with you previously. So yeah.
Thanks, Kelvin. And for those of us listening in our audience who may not be working in that more complex disability space, could you just briefly give us a bit of an outline of what you're talking about when you say restrictive practices?
So restrictive practice is unauthorized sort of restraint, whether it be chemical, environmental, mechanical, that has been deemed appropriate and less, the less restrictive way, in a sense, to be able to achieve an outcome, which in some cases to keep the individual with support safe. And usually in Victoria, we're unique enough where we have to adhere to the Disability Act 2006, which is where we do have interaction with Victorian senior practitioners, but also adhering to those NDIS quality and safeguarding standards. A restrictive practice is just something that has been authorized by clinicians who are qualified in that sort of space to say this is the least restrictive thing we can implement in someone's life to keep them safe. And one of the best things I like to add to that is to say, ongoing, we're going to review it with the long-term intention to fade that out, because you want to put restrictions in place to eventually create an environment where you can teach skills and develop the person in a space where they'll be able to effectively communicate in some cases what needs to have without necessarily having to have restrictive practice in place where you keep both them, the individual who's supporting, the staff, and the community safe.
Thanks, Kelvin. And, essentially, for those of us who've worked in the space before, that even imposing restrictive practices on a client or on a participant is a breach of their human rights, and it's definitely something that that none of us take lightly in our role. And it's probably the least favoured part of the role of, I'm sure, of a lot of the frontline staff that you've supported over time. Is definitely a complex challenge and challenging place to work, but also very rewarding as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this time we probably will touch base a bit later when we start talking about that psychosocial impact it might have on staff, because some of it come with a bit of moral stress, where you can see the impact those restrictions might have on an individuals, and just by the sheer nature of some of the characteristics people who work in the sector have, where you've got a very strong sense of justice, seeing those restrictions being in place and impeding on someone's right can create some sort of moral stress for staff as well. So